Okay, so today is this lecture is for to substitute for the lecture on 4.6, and up to this point we've been covering the processes that are involved in delivering oxygen into the body's tissues, to body tissues. Let's say that. Okay, and we said that there's a couple processes involved with that. We went through pulmonary ventilation. We went through external respiration, right? That is in the alveoli. And we said that this depended upon the partial pressures of oxygen and the pressures of CO2 within the alveoli. And this is really what we call the loading of oxygen onto hemoglobin. Okay, so that's external respiration, and then once hemoglobin is loaded, we talked about gas transport. Really, we talked about hemoglobin as a transport molecule. All right, and that really is transporting oxygen, how that works, and then where CO2 was in the plasma mainly, all right, carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate ions, right, and there's some that is attached to hemoglobin, but for the most part, approximately 70% of that is in the plasma. And now finally we at this point where we are delivering the gases, CO2, to the body's tissues, right? And this happens in the systemic capillaries, where oxygen is delivered. Well, this is the unloading of oxygen. Let's learn how to spell. Unloading of O2 from hemoglobin, right? So from HbO2, oxyhemoglobin, to tissues. And at the same time, this is where the plasma is going to pick up CO2. All right, so this is really exchange of gases at body cells. Okay, it's an all right, so we have carbon dioxide diffuses out of the tissue, right? Really, this is carbon dioxide loading, right, and unloading. So we have blood here and body tissues here. Okay, O2 from, all right, it's going to go to the body tissues, and then hemoglobin is going to become HHB, deoxyhemoglobin, and then CO2 is going to go from the body tissues into the plasma, right, of the blood. Okay, so that's the movement of tissues. All right, see this drawn out here. Tissue cells, right, diffuse loading of CO2 into the form, right, CO2 plus water, right, forms carbonic acid, but then that's broken down into the bicarbonate ion, and then we go from oxyhemoglobin to deoxyhemoglobin, and the oxygen is unloaded to body cells. This all happens within the systemic capillary. All right, and you see this again. This is a good figure to show you the percent oxygen that's here. Okay, so this is your inspired air. This is the atmosphere. All right, really high oxygen, really low CO2. And as it comes in, right, the alveoli of the lungs has a higher, even an increase in CO2 because of what's left over. All right, and then you have that O2 is higher than the blood, and it gets loaded onto the pulmonary veins and goes back. So the blood leaving the lungs, entering the tissues right here. Blood leaving the lungs, entering the tissues has a high CO2. Okay, you can see that and you compare that with your tissue cells. Make this comparison right here. right? So blood has a higher O2 than tissue. Okay, and that concentration of oxygen is going to drive diffusion go from hemoglobin to eventually to the body's tissues. And as you're going back, again, you see this difference in levels. Okay, so here you can see blood leaving the tissues. In this, blood leaving the tissues, entering the lungs, it has a higher CO2 than what the air that's going to be in the alveoli. All right, so that's now this is over here. The alveoli is after gas exchange. Okay, so now you have this higher CO2, so you end up, and then that's inspired out. So that covers how oxygen is brought into the body and delivered to body tissues. In response to those levels of gases, both CO2 and O2, the body will move and respond and have reflexes to changes in those in those gases, the levels of those gases. Okay, so if you have high oxygen, so there's this control of breathing, all right, and the nervous system controls breathing. So your activity of your respiratory muscles depends upon inputs from respiratory centers that are found within the medulla and the pons. All right, so the medulla sets your basic rhythm of breathing. All right, your respiration rate about 12 to 15. All right, 12 to 15 breaths per minute. All right, we'll call it breaths per minute. Okay, and then pons appears to smooth out respiration rate. So it's not just taking a quick breath in and out. It is smooth, kind of what we call sinusoidal. It has this rhythmic sinus rhythm that we see in and out, and it's not, in and out very quickly. It's nice and smooth. Okay, so within the medulla and the pons, you have some autonomic nuclei, right, that coordinate breathing. We would call the respiratory centers, and we have the medulla, and then these are the pons. Pontine refers to the pons. Okay, it's also known as the pneumotaxic center. But within the medulla, there's a couple, two groups: the ventral respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group, which is in the anterior and the posterior medulla, respectively. So what you end up with is these two centers coordinate information. All right, and so those in the neurons within the brainstem, they then relay messages from stimuli and receptors throughout the body, and then they relay that message and influence respiratory muscles. So they change, the influence of the diaphragm, the external intercostals, etc. Okay, so your ventral respiratory group, your VRG, right? They interact with low motor neurons of skeletal muscles in the spinal cord, all right, and then they go down, they project to the respiratory muscles. So then here you have, this is where you get the innervating the diaphragm, okay, and then the intercostal muscles. Right, so then those nerves then come off of there, those are your lower motor neurons. So the diaphragm, the phrenic nerves, and then the intercostal nerves. So that's just kind of the connections that are present from the ventral, the VRG, the ventral respiratory group, and the dorsal respiratory group. So now we know what the respiratory center is made up of. Okay? So like I said, your normal respiratory rate is about 12 to 15 respirations per minute, and this is normal respiration, eupnea, right? That's normal breathing. Any dysfunction from that is a disruption, and so we can breathe faster or increased, right? Hyperpnea is increased respiratory rate, right? Often due to extra oxygen needs, such as when you are exercising, okay? Right, so it could be deeper breaths, and also could be faster, right? So apnea is the absence of breathing. You probably heard about this when you heard about sleep apnea. Okay, so sleep apnea is a condition where you stop breathing during sleep. You don't know that you're stopped breathing, and then you kind of, most of the time, people start back up. All right, and that can be influenced by weight gain and nervous system inputs, etc. All right. And any abnormal or difficulty breathing is termed dyspnea, right? Difficulty or abnormal breathing. It's called so here are the centers. This when I transfer this slide looks complete in your slides that are posted on Blackboard, but here it looks a little bit disjointed. But you see here the phrenic and intercostal nerves, those are motor neurons. They innervate the skeletal muscles, and you have these sensory neurons, your afferent impulses that go to the medulla, and eventually some go to the pons, and then they transfer over. So you get this disruption from input from the signal, the receptors that are monitoring the gas levels, right? So we have CO2 and oxygen that are being monitored in different areas. We'll talk about those in a second. And they put this input into the medulla and the pons. So there's your afferent, impulse, and then you have an efferent nerve impulse that trigger the reaction. Okay, the contraction of the respiratory muscles. Okay, so here's the neural control. Okay, so we have these chemoreceptors. We're going to talk about these in a second. Chemoreceptors, right? They sense chemicals. In this case, they're sensing chemicals for, they're sensing CO2 and oxygen, okay, in different areas. So in this case, they're looking at the aortic bodies, right, in the blood, and they're monitoring CO2. In this case, in the cerebral spinal fluid, and we'll talk about that in a second. Right, the cerebral spinal fluid, which washes the brain over, and then over here you have peripheral chemoreceptors. So these are central receptors. They are mainly CO2. And you have peripheral chemoreceptors. They also decrease both CO2, hydrogen ions, and oxygen, and lowered oxygen levels. So they have different things. So we have high CO2, we have high H+, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then we have lowered oxygen levels that are all being are part of the stimulus. So when you have the stimulus comes in, okay, it goes to the different groups. Mainly, if you notice, it goes to this dorsal respiratory group, which then triggers over to the ventral respiratory group, and then you have this outpouring towards the intercostal nerves and the diaphragm, right? Other receptors as well feed into this. You see most of them go to this dorsal respiratory group, and then there's a transfer over. Not only that, you have the pons that actually goes to this as well. So the dorsal respiratory group probably takes all the stimulus in and then transfers over to the ventral respiratory group, where you end up with the motor neurons. Okay, so there's a couple non-neural factors that influence respiratory rate and depth, right? Exercise, talking. When you're talking, you're pushing air in and out faster and more. You have coughing and increased body temperature. And this is this is just kind of give you an idea about the different parts of the brain that also affect this. The hypothalamus, which affects your body temperature set point, right? That feeds into this. Volition, your conscious control, that's from the frontal lobe. And then emotional factors, we talked about crying and laughing, right, as having to do with respiration. That's from your limbic system, which controls emotions. Right, so different parts of the brain also have connections to the respiratory centers, the medulla, and mainly the medulla. Okay, so the non-neural factors, right? So CO2, right? We talked about CO2 is going to be recognized by a bunch of chemoreceptors, right, throughout the body, right? As this increases, that's going to cause CO2 goes up. That's going to cause an influence or a reflex in respiration. Okay, and CO2 in this case is your most important stimulus. Most important stimulus, right? The other stimuli we talked about is oxygen, hydrogen ions, right? But really, the increase in CO2, that's your biggest thing. Okay, and so what happens, you know that CO2, right, ends up in the blood, and it is actually forms bicarbonate ion. It actually forms before this. It forms bicarbonate or carbonic acid, right? And then this breaks into this, and hydrogen ions. So as levels increase of CO2, right, as CO2 goes up. So as CO2 goes up, okay, you end up with a decrease in pH. Because CO2 goes up, that leads to an increase in hydrogen ions, right? Because of what's happening over here, because of how CO2 ends up in the blood, right? You're going to end up and more CO2 is going to result in more hydrogen ions, and then that will in turn lead to an increase in respiration rate. Okay. And these changes, they act directly on the medulla. Okay, those two different, right? So we have chemoreceptors monitor the changes of CO2, oxygen, and hydrogen ions. And those central chemoreceptors, right, they monitor the pH of CSF because of what happens, right? So we know when CO2 goes up, okay, it's going to diffuse into CSF, right, through and the blood, right. Eventually, you're going to get in the blood, and it's going to cause H2CO3, okay, and then that's going to break into H plus and HCCO3 minus, okay. So this is carbonic acid. Okay, carbonic acid, and then this hydrogen ion, if this goes up, if CO2 goes up, hydrogen ion goes up, which then leads to blood pH goes down, right? Because we have a higher, it becomes more acidic, right? And actually lead to acidosis, where blood pH is below 7.35. Okay, and it happens with all the process, the normal processing of CO2. So CO2 goes up in the blood, then it diffuses from the blood to CSF, where then carbonic anhydrase, this enzyme builds carbonic acid from CO2 and water. Okay, so we increase CO2, then that dissociates into hydrogen ions, and you get lower pH. Okay, other receptors, so we talk about, those were central chemoreceptors. A couple other ones. We have proprioceptors of muscles and joints. They're stimulated by body movements. All right, so that feeds into stimulation, so you can feel respiration rates. There's a stimulus of not inflating the lungs too much, because you have that pressure receptor. And also baroreceptors in the pleura and the bronchioles respond to stretch. If they're stretched, that's more flow, and they feed into the brain. And then irritant receptors in the airway passageways. So if you inhale or other dust particles, it tends, right? So dust, right, pollution, etc. Right, smoke, okay, all that particulate matter stimulates these receptors, and then that causes, coughing, wheezing, etc. Okay. fiberglass or so that's carbon dioxide, but also monitors for the body also monitors for oxygen. So carbon dioxide is the most important factor. Other factors are also taken into account. So when the oxygen levels change, okay, they're detected by, or those oxygen receptors are peripheral receptors in a couple different areas, in the aorta and the common carotid artery. Now the common carotid artery goes where? And goes right to the brain. Okay, so if you think about these two blood vessels, the aorta and the common carotid artery, they're very important, right? So the blood that's coming out of the aorta or into the aorta, that is leaving the left ventricle, and ideally the aorta should have a very high amount of oxygen. The blood in the aorta should have a high amount of oxygen. It hasn't lost any as it's gone through systemic capillaries. It's coming right out of the left ventricle, so it should have a high amount of oxygen. Likewise, the common carotid artery is going to the brain. Okay, that blood that's going to the brain, going to the head, should also have a high amount of oxygen. All right, so these peripheral chemoreceptors that monitor oxygen, they're placed in those areas because they are important areas for monitoring the oxygen that's coming out. All right, so and they're stimulated by changes in these respiratory gases in blood, mainly, really O2 and lesser extent CO2. And then we know that this hydrogen ion is going to increase as CO2 increases. So the hydrogen ion is actually, we're responding to this stuff that's actually produced outside of the CO2. So it's really not related to that. These peripheral chemoreceptors are actually looking at other sources of hydrogen ions, and there are others where you have, urinary system issues and cardiovascular issues that lead to the increase in hydrogen ions. And then your body will help. The respiratory system helps counteract that by increasing respiration. And all this information is sent to the medulla, the respiratory centers, and influence respiration rate. Okay? And so now the chemoreceptors, they send a stimulus, and then they send the signals mainly to, like I said, the dorsal respiratory group. That's relayed to the ventral respiratory group, and then this group triggers the changes in rhythm and force. Okay? So we can influence both the rate and depth of breathing. When normal tidal volume has this normal sinusoid, but we know we could increase the rate of breathing, right? Make it go faster in and out. And then we could also increase the depth, okay? Make it go, breathe more air in, more air out. Okay, so ventilation, so breathing, right, increases in response to increased hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions, increased ventilation. Okay, and also detecting increase in blood A plus or CO2. So increase. This is in the, let's say, CSF, right? And then increased hydrogen ion in the blood, or increased CO2, right? All of that leads to higher ventilation, increased breathing rate. Okay, so what's that going to do? That's going to more air that goes in and out. That's going to lead to more CO2 leaving the body. CO2 leaves the body. Guess what else happens? So this CO2 leaves, your increased ventilation, then the CO2 percentage of CO2 in the body goes down, and you're also blowing off hydrogen ions. Okay, and then so ventilation then decreases if you detect that they're coming back to normal. So it's a negative feedback loop that's happening. Okay, in some cases, sometimes we end up with hyperventilation. which is hyperventilation, is breathing rate or depth above the body's demand. All right, so you don't, it's an abnormal situation where you're breathing too much. Okay? And this can be caused by emotional factors, neurological factors, anxiety, ascending to a high altitude, right? Because then we're going to have what's going to happen here. We're going to have a low oxygen below normal, right? Increased CO2, and now the body's going to try to move this oxygen in faster, right? We have to move air in faster to get the same amount of oxygen. Or it could be voluntary, like you did in lab, right? As this happens, hyperventilation, right, in the blood, right, in the air, in the alveoli, you increase O2. And this is transient. Okay, so you get, there's a way of your body responding and getting oxygen into the alveoli, more oxygen into the alveoli faster. Okay, and in that case, CO2 goes up, right, and then CO2 goes down because you're not allowing diffusion to occur, right? And then, but this oxygen's not going anywhere because you already have the hemoglobin already not at that saturation curve, right? You can't get it anymore. Remember, if you recall, in lecture we said that if you wanted to get it above 98% saturation, that's kind of the limit. You could get above that, but you have to have you have to be at a higher pressure than 1 atmosphere, and that requires a hyperbaric chamber. So your body's not doing anything, all right? So you're not getting that extra oxygen that's in there is not getting into the blood because hemoglobin already has as much as it can hold. So you have this movement of air, but it's not, the oxygen's not diffusing and not being loaded, but at the same time, oxygen is not being loaded, but CO2 is being unloaded. And so you get this greater loss of CO2 from the blood, which is called hypocapnia. Okay, and that can lead to, increased blood pH and other things. Okay, and then it also causes vasoconstriction. Okay, so vasoconstriction, blood vessels decrease and actually can decrease the oxygen delivery to the brain. Right, it may decrease the like I said, the blood hydrogen ion concentration, right, which result in what's called respiratory alkalosis. Alkalosis means pH above 7.45, blood pH above 7.45. So the more CO2 you expel, also the more hydrogen ions, and then the pH goes down, right? So if that happens. So hyperventilation may cause you to faint, dizziness, numbness, tingling, cramps, tetany, which is muscle contraction. If it continues over long, loss of consciousness, coma, possible death if it really, really goes on for long. But usually when someone loses consciousness, they kind of stop ventilating. Okay? And then hyperventilation can be a response to increased CO2 in the blood, which is acidosis, right? And then so your breathing becomes deeper and more rapid, and you blow off CO2, okay? And then with that CO2, you also blow off hydrogen ions, and that restores the blood back to normal pH. Opposite to hyperventilation is hypoventilation. Okay, hypoventilation is breathing too slow. Too slow is bradypnea, or too shallow, hypopnea. Okay, causes obstruction and then pneumonia, right? Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD, a brainstem injury in the pons of the medulla, and other respiratory conditions such as bronchitis. You could have lung cancer. You could include asthma. I don't know how to spell asthma in this. All right, but when you're not ventilating the lungs the right way, O2 levels decrease, CO2 levels go up. Okay, so which then if O2 levels in the alveoli are low and high CO2, they're not going to get that loading of oxygen onto hemoglobin. Therefore, blood oxygen goes down. That's hypoxia, hypoxemia, which could lead to hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels in the tissues. And then blood CO2 increases hypercapnia, right? Hypercapnia, which is increased CO2 in the blood. Okay. This results in not enough oxygen getting to the tissues. It may result in increased hydrogen ion concentration due to high blood pH, right? And then you end up with the other thing, respiratory acidosis. This is pH of the blood goes below 7.35, right? Because we have increased, you have that increased CO2 in the blood, which then leads to increased hydrogen ions in the blood and leads to acidosis. So some symptoms of that: lethargy, sleepiness, headache, polycythemia. Polycythemia is an increase in red blood cells. Okay, all right, abnormal. This is kind of abnormal. Trying to make more red blood cells to deliver more oxygen to the tissues. Right, it could cause loss of consciousness and death if prolonged. Hypoventilation is also a response to alkalosis, right? Maybe this is from other source, right? There's other sources of alkalosis, typically used, related to urinary problems. Okay, so this is response when the pH of the blood goes up. You slow down breathing and help to conserve oxygen. Okay, conserve and store CO2, and this causes more hydrogen ions to be present, and then you end up causing the blood to come back down in between 7.35 to 7.45. Right, but so hypoventilation can cause this, and hyperventilation they kind of counteract to help maintain blood pH. Okay, it allows CO2 to accumulate in the blood. Now, breathing is also an important exercise. Breathing shows hyperpnea to meet increased tissue needs, increased depth. The rate remains close to the same. You can voluntarily, but it does remain close to the same. And at that point, blood oxygen and CO2 remain relatively constant because of the difference in ventilation. And you end up with increased cellular respiration needs, and the respiratory stimulated from a couple different causes, corollary motor, right? And then this conscious anticipation of exercise. You think I'm going to go exercising or I'm going to go for a run, you actually start breathing faster and deeper beforehand in a nervous anticipation of exercise. So that covers all of the respiratory material normal, but I do want to talk about a couple different respiratory disorders that are associated. All right, and one of which I've already mentioned is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, and these are exemplified by two different things: chronic bronchitis and emphysema. All right, so both of those now are grouped in to COPD. And this is a major cause of death and disability in the United States, mostly involved with smoking, right? Smoking causation. Features, right? They almost always have a history of smoking. Okay. And so they have labored breathing or dyspnea. That becomes progressively more severe over time. These people have disrupted tissues within the alveoli. The respiratory membrane is disrupted or covered with debris that's been inhaled, and you end up with this. There's an obstruction that's stopping this from happening. And then you have coughing, and frequent pulmonary infections are common because that obstructive nature prevents mucus and it allows stuff to accumulate. Dust cells cannot go through and clear out the debris. So whatever bacteria gets in stays there and causes problems. Most victims are hypoxic, right? So they have low oxygen in the tissues. They retain carbon dioxide. All right, so if they retain carbon dioxide, I mean they have high CO2 in the blood, which then leads to increased hydrogen ions, and then that leads to respiratory acidosis. All right, and in response to that, the body's trying to ventilate the lungs more, and so they have this hyperventilation. All right, eventually it leads to respiratory failure and death. All right, but hopefully we're trying to use research to develop that. Okay, and here's chronic bronchitis, long-term bronchitis. The mucosa of the lower respiratory passage becomes severely inflamed. All right, so we're talking about the bronchioles and the tertiary bronchi are inflamed, increased mucus. Now you end up with increased mucus. So if the bronchi start at this stage and they become inflamed, and then they have irritated tissues, okay, and now they're inflamed, and now you have mucus on top of that that's being produced. What has happened to the diameter of this bronchiole over time? It's gone from here to here, right? The diameter has shrunk, in half. All right. Pneumonia is common. This is called blue bloaters due to hypoxia, right? So blue, and cyanosis means a blue tissue. Blue bloaters, right? Their chest actually gets a little inflamed, and then in emphysema, the alveoli enlarge, right? So we know that there's different chambers between alveoli. Lung fibrosis, right? So they lose some elasticity. Airways collapse during expiration, and so they use this large amount of energy to exhale. All right, and so you get this expanded barrel chest, and they're also, so in this case there's no cyanosis that appears. It happens real late, so they're called pink puffers. All right, so they're kind of barrel chest. Someone has like this, and their chest is out, pushed out, and they have this pink puffer look, it's called. All right, so tobacco smoke, air pollution continually irritates the bronchioles, right? Causes inflammation. You have chronic bronchitis. Either way, what's happening is you have this frequent infections, whether you're looking at chronic bronchitis or emphysema, two different causes with similar outcomes: difficulty breathing, airway obstruction, frequent infections, eventually respiratory failure. Just two different causes of the disease, of the problem of obstructing the airways and leading to increased CO2 levels, cyanosis, etc. So that covers the rest of chapter 23, and now you will have a couple assignments. Your exam date is posted on Blackboard, so you can go look on Blackboard for any further instructions. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.